Thank you very much, and again, thanks for the organisers for inviting me to speak on this panel. So I'll give you my responses to the broad problem as it's been presented in the various background briefings. And as far as I'm concerned, our concern here is with the potential impact of emerging technologies to enhance current capabilities to detect ballistic missile submarines. In particular, the capacity for a network of technologies to detect, track and target with a high degree of accuracy. As such, I see this as concerned with a much wider phenomenon of mass surveillance to enable precision effects in a battle space, as we've seen with the technologies and methodologies developed for prosecution of the war on terror in a different context. So the question then is, how might this affect Britain's nuclear posture as we currently understand it today? Before getting into that, I think it's important to note two things. First, this discussion centres on the practice of nuclear deterrence, which remains an abstract system of thought with only a slim empirical base. Second, in this discussion, we are populating the future with our imaginings of potential impacts from existing or plausible technologies, the impacts on current submarine technologies and operations. So you bring those two together and we are necessarily in the area of speculation. I'd also condition our thinking about this subject by encouraging us to think specifically about the political role of British nuclear weapons deployed at sea on submarines. Now, UK government narratives have progressively narrowed the formal role of our nuclear weapons, of their political utility, if you like, towards the idea of a very last resort, i.e. their role is in the context of existential salvation of the British Isles, potentially a NATO ally, faced with certain and imminent threat of being bombed past the point of recovery. Now, clearly nuclear weapons have been used by this country and by other countries for other purposes, coercion, political signalling, threat-making, intimidation and so on, in contexts that lack that existential dimension. But for the purposes of my reflections on this issue, I'm limiting the role of nuclear weapons to this deterrent effect that gets ascribed to nuclear weapons by virtue of a capacity to deliver a massive retaliatory nuclear strike against another society as a very last resort. And here, of course, we are in this country primarily concerned with Russia, a country that NATO sees itself collectively and somewhat innocently menaced, a country that's extensively nuclear armed, and a country that could conceivably develop and deploy the types of technologies that are under discussion. So for me, the pertinent question in this context then is whether these technologies that are being discussed can hold a British ballistic missile submarine at risk in a politically meaningful way. So i.e., by that I mean a way that diminishes the perceived value of submarine-based nuclear weapons in peacetime or in a crisis. So here we're asking then how much detection and perhaps even sustained tracking of a British submarine at sea, how much that matters in terms of a technical operational capability of the UK to launch a nuclear weapon on demand, and thereby the capacity of the government to issue what it considers to be a credible nuclear threat. Here I think the impact of these technologies could be limited. In the scenarios we're talking about, it would really require Moscow to have a demonstrable capability to detect, track, and hold, for all intents and purposes, hold at immediate risk a British SSBN during a crisis. It would likely involve preemptive destruction or disabling of that submarine, which would, of course, be an unavoidably escalatory act, an act of war, destroying a prized military asset and killing 100+ submariners. If we extend that scenario further, if this is done as part of, say, a wider Russian attack on the UK or NATO that has these existential consequences for the UK, then timescales really begin to contract. If in such a crisis the UK has its SSBN on quick reaction alert, as we did in the Cold War, 15 minutes notice to fire, then this system that we might imagine Moscow having successfully developed and deployed is going to have to be able to act very quickly. You're going to have a networked system under direct executive political control from Moscow, able to act on demand, assuredly, against a British submarine at sea. I think that will be a very difficult task that will be fraught with actually uncertainty and risk for Moscow in this speculative scenario. But what I think is at stake in this debate is the logic of nuclear deterrence that's deployed by the UK government to justify our continued retention of nuclear weapons. Now, government narratives routinely frame the case for Trident in terms of certainties, usually in the form of that familiar soundbite of nuclear weapons providing an ultimate insurance, a guarantee of nuclear protection from foreign nuclear nasties. And this logic of nuclear deterrence developed through the Cold War rests on this idea of a secure, assured second strike capability. We can have a discussion based on what Heather talked about as to how important this dimension of supposed stability is to a wider stability in a political relationship. That's contested. But the logic of deterrence rests on that. An assured operational capacity to give a nuclear attacker a dose of its own nuclear medicine. Now, that narrative of certainty is a false one. It's deployed primarily in the UK for nuclear marketing purposes. Numerous studies have shown that there are fundamental political uncertainties associated with the theory and practice of nuclear deterrence. So with that in mind, what some of these sort of network technologies to detect, track and potentially target a UK SSBN would do is add to these uncertainties. It would create perhaps new operational uncertainties on top of existing political uncertainties. It's not going to move you from a place of absolute certainty to uncertainty. So what any new layers of operational uncertainty might then do is add further weight to existent questions about the added deterrence value of British nuclear weapons in terms of the contribution that they're seen to make to our security, to war prevention for the UK and for NATO. It's also important to consider here, I think, drawing on some of the things that Drew mentioned, the compound effect of uncertainties that might be induced by possible developments in cyber capabilities to disrupt submarine command and control operations, advances in ballistic missile interception over the coming 20, 30, 40 years. And so we must be prepared to consider the possibility that the technological feasibility of secure second strike for nuclear weapons is going to diminish. And on the basis of that understanding of nuclear deterrence, could render the practices of nuclear deterrence intrinsically unstable. Again, according to existent understandings of nuclear deterrence. This could raise further doubts about the efficacy of nuclear-based conceptions of national security, could prompt changes in nuclear practices, could prompt investment in alternative nuclear basing modes, delivery systems, and so on. But for the UK, given that the UK nuclear weapons complex remains deeply embedded in its American counterpart, I think it's unlikely that some of the developments outlined in some of the background documents would steer us away from a submarine deployed ballistic missile capability, unless the United States took its nuclear capabilities in new directions upon which we could perhaps piggyback at limited cost. And for us, it looks like the United States is likely to remain at the forefront of any emergent submarine detection, tracking and targeting technologies and counter technologies from which we would likely benefit given the history and current status of our strategic nuclear relationship. But to go back to a point that, just to finish off, to go back to a point that Seb raised at the start, this question of incentives, I think it's important to question the incentives for substantial investment in a mass system of detection and tracking and targeting, specifically of SSBNs, in order to try and somehow permanently hold them at risk. I think absent the intensity of the Cold War nuclear arms dynamic, plus the continuing inflation of the cost of military equipment, the case for investment in some kind of wide area SSBN detection system, I think is probably going to remain pretty limited. I think what may be more likely is the development of network systems to target attack submarines and perhaps carrier battle groups in very discrete theatres of conflict. And okay, in future generations we may see on the back of that the potential for perhaps scaling up to area-wide ocean surveillance. But to pick up on some of Heather's points from the 1970s, it's also possible that incentives for mass ocean surveillance, specifically targeting SSBNs, could be limited if those nuclear adversaries that could conceivably participate in this, if they are socialized into a shared understanding of nuclear deterrence that privileges secure submarine-based second strike as inherently stabilizing. If the participants in this technological game all agree, share that norm that stability rests on ensuring the undetectability of your submarines at sea, then we may not see the development of these technologies in politically meaningful ways. Just to finish with a final point then, perhaps more likely though, is that this sort of, as these technologies are developed, technology-induced nuclear insecurity of the type that we see consistently expressed by Russia with respect to American missile defenses and conventional global strike would be the direction of travel, and would no doubt be compounded by any future US comprehensive capacity to negate Russian SSBNs.